Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Spiller, as you, in all these amendments, you keep saying there's no problem, there's no problem. If we do not accept, you don't accept this amendment, and this amendment doesn't go on the bill, and your legislation only says port of entry. If an officer takes a person to the Port of Houston, is that appropriate?
I couldn't understand the last part of the question.
If an officer takes someone that they believe is undocumented and is in the country and entered the country illegally and violated Texas immigration law, and they wanted to take them to a port of entry, is the Houston Seaport Houston Seaport in the Houston Ship Channel, is that an appropriate place for them to go?
Is it appropriate? You know, again, it provides law enforcement the authority to take them to a port of entry. I don't know, this bill, quite frankly, doesn't say if you cross the Rio Grande. Someone could violate the provisions of this bill by coming in through the Houston Seaport. It may very well be that the Houston Seaport is the most appropriate place if that is a port of entry. So I don't want to restrict it.
What ship should they go back on?
What's that?
What ship should they go back on?
I don't know. I'm not, you know, they would be returned to where the country that they came in the most appropriate and presumably the most cost-efficient manner.
Does your legislation provide any funding for them to return?
This is not a funding bill, no.
Okay. Does your bill require ships to take on passengers?
My bill does not talk about ships. Ships or planes or anything else.
It doesn't have any requirement that they have to accept the people that officers trying to return as passengers, correct?
My bill doesn't address that, no.
Your bill doesn't address it at all, right?
It doesn't. We don't talk about the modes of transportation to get someone from a port of entry to the country from which they came.
Does that not appear to you to be missing a significant portion of the process that needs to happen?
Not in my mind. Not in my mind, it's not.
Okay. So if an officer takes a person to a port of entry and just leaves them there, that's perfectly acceptable.
Well, the purpose of taking, if you opt in the in lieu of language as the prosecution, and you take someone to a port of entry, the whole purpose is to order them back to the country from which they came. Obviously, that may not be feasible if they're at the Houston Seaport unless they came on a ship. So, you know, we're talking about hypotheticals that probably aren't going to apply here. Well, you know, I don't know. It just depends on the circumstances. Again,
well, Mr. Spiller,
we keep trying to tie law enforcement's hands, and I don't want to do that. Law enforcement, they know how to do their job, but I don't want to tell them how to do their job.
I'm not trying to tie law enforcement's hands. I'm trying to provide law enforcement with actual guidance and process how to do this. If a Houston Police Department officer takes a person that they believe is undocumented and has violated Texas law, violated Texas's immigration law, and they take them to the Port of Houston and say, well, this is where you say you came in, this is where I'm leaving you. Is that okay? Is that acceptable? Because that's the end of the process in your bill.
All right. The whole point of the bill, and that portion of the bill to return someone, is to order them back to the country from which they came. So the example that you gave makes it very difficult to do that if there's no mode or process by which they get to that country. So I don't know how to answer that question. It's really inapplicable the way that I look at it.
But Mr. Spiller, that is a situation that happens all the time. People stow away on ships, and once if they come here, they get caught. The ships that they stowed away on aren't going to want them back on. Is that fair? Well, so what is the mechanism? If you take this person back to the port of entry, what is the mechanism for them to get back on the ship?
Well, quite frankly, that may be the instance where you don't return someone. Maybe you prosecute them under the Class B misdemeanor that provides for, and that assumes that they're not otherwise you couldn't charge them with something more serious than a Class B misdemeanor if they're stowing away on ships. I don't know, but again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but law enforcement needs to have the tools and the wherewithal to make those determinations, because the whole purpose of this bill is not to incarcerate more people, it's to turn them back and get them back to where they came if they got here illegally.
Thank you for your answer. I appreciate that. And we serve in here with former officers. We serve in here with a lot of former prosecutors. And I'm a former prosecutor. I've racked my brain on what, if I was still in the office, what I would tell an officer to do based on the law that you've written, and I have no idea. I have no idea if someone gets off a plane and then later we discover that they were here unlawfully, like their visa expired and they're now undocumented, and you wanted to return them. Where should they go? Where should an officer take them?
And again, I trust law enforcement and quite frankly, the input of prosecutors, who I value their judgment and their input. I trust them to make the proper decision based on a case-by-case basis and a totality of the circumstances.
Well, let's walk through that. Let's try that out. Let's pretend you and I are both officers. We have a person right here who needs to be taken back. They got here on a plane from Haiti. They overstayed their visa. They're now undocumented. Let's you and I work out what port of entry they should be taken to.
Well, you're assuming that I'm qualified myself to make those determinations. So
well, you're
I've
an
never
attorney.
claimed, I claim a lot of things, but I don't claim to have that knowledge and that understanding. So
if you as an attorney cannot think of a reasonable way for this person to be returned, how do you expect the tens of thousands of officers in this state who have to deal with this law, who have to deal with your law, how do you expect them to do it?
Well, I trust our law enforcement. They make those decisions on a daily basis. I don't. I'm not qualified to do that, but I trust them to make those decisions, and I want to give them the ability to make a decision on a case-by-case basis.
Mr. Spiller, do you know if law enforcement officers get special training on how to deport people?
I don't know that.
Should you have found out before carrying this bill?
Not necessarily. I trust DPS and other law enforcement to make those decisions.